and I know a lot of people think that the scientific approach like has nothing to do with intuition. But if you listen to scientists themselves, they talk a lot about extracting information from their intuition.
Yeah.
So I think there's a barrier there. A lot of people who outside of science think that scientists are all against intuition. So yeah,
Well,
it's not the
yeah.
case.
So what happens here is that intuition gets to become something that you train, in a
Yes,
sense that
yes,
we do have an intuition about something like flat Earth. We have an intuition about how gravity works. This is something that uh, 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 we evolved in the presence of gravity. We have all of our instincts calibrated to account for gravity, and so there is something to say about intuition. Intuition is something that is there. It's just that we have not evolved in a way that we were able to assimilate the mathematical aspects of the world, for example. This is something that we have the equipment to do it, but it's not something that comes naturally. And so that intuition that starts from the basic things that we get from everyday experience is not negated from by science. Rather, it's the other way around. We actually try to expand on this
yes.
to show that there are certain aspects of the basic intuitive understanding of the world that do get preserved, but there are others that need to be modified and to be fine-tuned and reformed, sometimes based on how the world works.
Now, like you said, though, I'm sorry to clarify the clarification of the clarification, but so um, oh, I think I just lost it. Oh, so you talked about training your intuition. So I want to say something that Feynman said in one of his books. I don't remember which one I read it in. Probably the one. Surely you're joking. He described in there. He was describing a lot of his days. I think during the Manhattan Project,
Hmm.
and he would describe how he would take another physicist and they would sit down for an hour or two and just play around with some mathematical equations or some concept. And Feynman, the way he said it was, let's do this to develop an intuition about it.
Hmm.
He
Yeah.
used those words, to develop an intuition about it. And that's kind of like people use different phrases that like um I want to wrap my head around something. I
Yeah.
think that's the same phrase, same concept. Meaning, like, if you're brand new to it, okay, you're gonna be brand new to it. You don't have any intuition about it. It's no different than if you're the first time getting on a bike, you don't know how to ride it yet. For you to successfully ride a bike that first time, you really have to put a lot of conscious attention on exactly what you have to do. Almost every muscle, not every muscle, but what you have to do, and and then you do that enough, and now it's all intuitive. In other words, we say is second nature,
Hmm.
and you don't have to put any conscious attention to it, but you're still doing all those same things. So that's happening with scientists. They're new to a topic, none of it is intuitive. You dig deep for a while, and now it comes out of you almost instantaneously with no thinking, but there is
Right.
thinking. It's
Yeah.
called
So
under the hood thinking.
So
Yeah.
I can bring up an example from teaching, for example, introductory physics to people who have not learned introductory physics before, something like mechanics.
Hmm.
So we usually now take for granted something like Newton's laws, but this is something that's really highly counterintuitive because of the fact that if you go back, for example, to when Aristotle was thinking about motion and how
So like
motion,
2,500 years ago.
yeah, how motion gets described, he didn't, for example, take into account that friction is everywhere, and so the idea of pushing an object and seeing it maintain its motion is not something that you would see in everyday life. And so this is something that's very counterintuitive, and yet the first law of mechanics, as formulated by Galileo and then Newton, is exactly based on the idea that if you give a push to an object, in the absence of any force acting on it, it's going to maintain that motion indefinitely. Or if it's staying at rest, it's going to stay at rest indefinitely.
So the word they use for that is inertia.
Yeah, exactly. So the first law of mechanics is the law of inertia. So this is something that's very counterintuitive, and trying to see how people who are taking the course for the first time are training themselves to assimilate this idea, which does not accord with how we perceive things in everyday life, is basically trying to train that intuition so that hopefully by the end of the course, even though this was not something that you learned growing up, not only as a human, but going back to primates, this is friction is everywhere, and so we don't see things starting to move on their own, unless, for example, there is slippery ice somewhere that would make it easier for that to happen. And so this kind of training process is something that sometimes can be really really hard for people who haven't seen this before, and it can take some time, but once you're there, once you have trained that intuition, you're actually able to see that actually this actually makes a lot of sense. It's not something that started off as something that's completely counterintuitive, that goes against your rational understanding of the world. In fact, it's something that's perfectly sensible, is in accordance with how you understand things. But of course, the most important thing is to not only be able to experiment, but also to um, uh, 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 um, uh, give some credence to certain assumptions that might contradict assumptions that you had at the beginning. So once you, like in any kind of logical deductions, if you're going to be making some kind of a syllogism, you have to start from certain assumptions, and those assumptions are probably the things that you need to work on the most at the beginning.